Technology can make learning Chinese easier, but only if it helps you engage more with the language. Used poorly, the same tools can get in the way of learning instead of supporting it. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In last week's episode, we talked about some of the benefits of using digital technology to learn Chinese, but as I mentioned, there are also some downsides that you should be aware of, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. Before we get started, I want to say that technology in general has a large positive impact on learning Chinese, so just because I'm highlighting the downsides in this episode doesn't mean that I normally think that technology is a bad thing. It's just that you need to be aware of how you use it so you can reap all the benefits while avoiding some common traps and pitfalls. Modern learners of Chinese have access to digital dictionaries, podcasts, videos, subtitles, apps, and much more, and all these things make learning the language much easier compared to what it was like in the previous century. If you want to learn more about how to leverage technology to your advantage when learning Chinese, you should tune into last week's episode, but in this episode then we are going to focus on the downsides, or how technology can stop you from learning Chinese. As is the case with any tool, it depends on how you use it. A digital dictionary can help you understand harder texts, but it can also stop you from reading the texts if you rely on it too much. Subtitles can make spoken Chinese easier to understand, but it also shifts the focus from listening to reading. And flashcards can help you remember vocabulary, but they can also make you chase numbers that don't actually mean much. In this episode, I'm going to focus on potential problems of technology when learning languages in general and Chinese in particular. I'm not too interested in general downsides of technology, such as privacy, environmental impact, screen time, social effects, etc. But rather, I will focus on things that are relevant specifically for learners of Chinese. So in essence, technology creates 4 common traps. First, technology can reduce the amount of Chinese you use. Second, technology can change what kind of Chinese you practice. Third, technology can reduce how deeply you process Chinese. And fourth, technology can make you chase the wrong target. Let's discuss these in turn so you know what to pay attention to and what traps to be aware of. The first trap is that technology can reduce the amount of Chinese you use. So suppose you are in a Chinese-speaking environment and you need to find your way somewhere. Without having access to digital technology, the best option here is to ask someone for the way. You need to explain where you want to go, and you need to listen to the answer, make sense of that, follow the directions, and probably repeat this a few times until you find the way to wherever you were going. This can be very messy, but it's also functional, and it's real-world practice. With a smartphone, however, you can get there much faster and more reliably. This can be a good thing. If you're tired and just want to find your way to the hotel, you might not want to jump through all these language hoops just to get some extra Chinese practice. From a language learning perspective, though, the problem here is that the GPS removes the situation where you could have used Chinese for something meaningful. So in essence, technology allows you to live, travel, and solve problems while using much less Chinese than you would have needed without the technology. This was just one example though, and I want to mention many examples here because you might not have realized how much you rely on technology and why that can be a bad thing. For example, it used to be that you had to call hotels or restaurants to make reservations, and if you wanted to go by train, you had to go somewhere and book a ticket instead of just going online. Again, this can be very convenient, but that is also part of the problem. Because technology makes these things so easy to solve without Chinese, we often prefer to not use Chinese even though we could have. Shopping is another good example here. If you want to buy something such as a computer and you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, you can now do all the research online and you don't need to use a word of Chinese to buy your computer. You could instead have done what I did when I needed a computer when I lived in Taiwan, namely to go to a bunch of different computer stores and just ask them about different types of computers, monitors, etc. And obviously this took much longer than ordering a computer online, but I also learned a lot more by doing so. And you don't need to buy computers for this to be true. Just choosing a supermarket that has some kind of self-checkout, for example, allows you to skip Chinese instead of going to a market where you actually have to talk to people. Many of these examples make more sense if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, but this problem is not limited to that. Machine translation is now very good, and you can use a tool to translate any website into your native language. That allows you to find the information very quickly, but it also bypasses the need to read in Chinese for some kind of information that you actually wanted. So the problem here is not to occasionally use technology to bypass Chinese. It is when you systematically let technology solve problems for you that you could have solved in Chinese. This will impact your language development over time, and since these cases also tend to be very functional, meaning that you want to actually use Chinese for something real, it's extra bad to let technology solve these issues for you. This brings us to trap number 2. Technology can change what kind of Chinese you practice. This one is a little bit more subtle. Technology doesn't remove Chinese entirely, but it changes the kind of Chinese you are practicing, sometimes without you noticing. Transcripts and subtitles that I mentioned earlier are a good example of this. Seeing what people are saying written down usually makes it easier to understand, but you are no longer focusing on listening as much as you used to. If understanding comes through reading the Chinese characters, you are mostly practicing reading and not listening. Again, this is not inherently bad, but it is bad if you want to improve your listening ability. If you want to use transcripts or subtitles, you should do so after you've listened without them first. The reverse case, relying on spoken Mandarin to understand written texts, can also be a problem. So let's say your listening is very good, but your reading is not. If you then listen to texts instead of reading them, you have transformed reading practice into listening practice. Another example of this is typing instead of handwriting characters. This is perhaps the clearest example of technology transforming one kind of activity into another. You are no longer writing characters stroke by stroke, but rather typing their pronunciations and choosing candidates from a list when you need to. Typing is of course a valid way to produce Chinese text, and for most learners it is what you should do most of the time. Learning to write by hand everything you can type is extremely time-consuming and not something I recommend that most students do. For a fuller discussion of this topic, please check out episode 199, Chinese Character Learning for All Students. The point here is that a computer or smartphone can convert the activity of writing by hand into typing, which is clearly a different activity. As I said, this is usually a good thing, but that doesn't stop typing from being a lousy way of reviewing Chinese characters, if that's what you want to learn. A somewhat related example is using a digital tool to add pinyin to text that you are reading, and this causes most students to just ignore the characters, and so you have converted reading characters into reading pinyin, and these are also two different activities. With the risk of repeating myself, this is not necessarily a bad thing. You just need to be aware of what you're doing and what the effect will be on your learning. Ask yourself what you're trying to achieve, what are you trying to learn, and if the activities you engage in are actually aligned with that. So for example, if your goal is just to communicate in text, then typing is great, but if your goal is to write characters by hand, then typing isn't very good. The solution is probably not to write characters by hand all the time, but for example, you could use the handwriting input on your phone to write some characters by hand, or maybe the first 5 minutes of an email by hand, or something like that. So be aware that technology can transform one activity into another and that they might have different impacts on your Chinese learning. Now, trap number 3. Technology can reduce how deeply you process Chinese. This trap is not about changing the activity. You're still practicing Chinese and you're practicing the right skill, but technology stops you from processing the language deeply enough. And generally speaking, the more deeply you process something, the more you will learn. I think digital dictionaries and pop-up dictionaries are the best example of this. On the one hand, they make reading much easier and they stop you from wasting a lot of time looking things up in a paper dictionary, but on the other hand, they can also stop you from processing sentences deeply enough, and you might give up too early if you have an easily accessible answer in your dictionary. If you click or tap on every unknown word immediately, or just slide your cursor over the entire sentence reading the pop-up definitions, you are essentially not reading anymore. You're not developing good reading strategies such as relying on contextual clues, relying on character and component knowledge, or simply guessing what something means and then later checking if your hypothesis was correct. If you have easy access to the right answer immediately, you skip all these things, and all these are necessary to become a good reader in a language. So the problem here is not the dictionary itself. The problem is using the dictionary before your brain has processed the Chinese enough. The same can be said about grammar. Reading a text and trying to figure out what it means is good practice, but if you turn to AI tools to explain everything you don't know immediately, you don't develop the ability to deal with these things without that tool. Another example is feedback and corrections. If you write a text in Chinese and hand it over to an AI tool and ask for corrections, this can be useful, but if you just accept all the changes blindly and let it implement them for you, you won't learn anything by doing so. The learning happens when you compare your version with the corrected version, because this can highlight things that don't work in Chinese that you thought worked, so it's a kind of negative evidence, if you will. But if you don't think about the feedback before it gets implemented, you won't learn anything. Admittedly, this problem is not related to AI or even to technology specifically, because many students do this with human teachers too. They get feedback and then they look at the grade and they throw it away. They don't go through the feedback properly and implement and revise what they have written. Or they don't process the feedback deeply enough to benefit from it. From a language learning perspective, it doesn't really matter if you ask your language exchange partner or ChatGPT to rewrite your paragraph or text for you, but since the AI is so easily accessible and fast, it becomes very convenient to do this, and so I think this is much more common these days than it used to be. The important distinction here is between wasted effort and useful effort. So some effort is clearly needed. I just said that the deeper you process something, the more you will learn. But on the other hand, we also have some kind of effort that we want to stay away from. For example, as I mention occasionally on the podcast, when I started learning Chinese, we didn't have pinyin for some of the example sentences in our textbook, and we ended up spending maybe an hour per chapter simply looking up characters in a dictionary. And this time could have been spent doing something else, such as reading more, for example, but we couldn't because there weren't any good digital dictionaries back then. This kind of effort doesn't contribute to learning much and is thus wasted, so using technological tools to get rid of it is a good thing. But if we rely on the same tools too much, we can also remove the good effort, the deep processing that we need to learn. Clearly, the solution is not to do away with all digital tools, but it is to occasionally try to learn Chinese without them. Try reading texts where you don't look anything up, or at least try reading the text without your pop-up dictionary first, and then use the dictionary to look up things you didn't understand. And of course, if you need to use a dictionary all the time when reading or listening, you could just choose easier Chinese to listen to and read, and you wouldn't need to use the dictionary, and you would also learn more. We have now reached the fourth and final trap. Technology can make you chase the wrong target. This is something we discussed at length in a recent episode, namely episode 301, Effective Progress or Experience Points, the double-edged sword of measuring your Chinese learning. So I won't talk about this too much here. The point is that most activities you should engage in when learning Chinese are hard to measure. How do you, for example, measure your level of engagement in a conversation, or how much you focused when you were listening to a podcast, or how much you enjoyed a graded reader? Technology, on the other hand, in the shape of learning apps, offer measurable progress in abundance. They give you streaks, XP, badges, completion bars, and little congratulatory pop-up notes with confetti, and so on. Learning Chinese with these tools feels satisfying because it confirms that you did something and that you're making progress. As usual, this is not bad in and of itself. Streaks can build habits and XP can motivate, and a completion bar is nice to show you that you're actually moving forward. But don't make the mistake of thinking that the measurement is the thing measured. Measurable progress is not the same thing as meaningful progress. The problem arises when these measurable activities crowd out the meaningful ones, so you study Duolingo because you want to maintain your streak instead of listening to a podcast or reading something in Chinese. Or you have invested a lot of time into flashcards and you prioritize keeping your due count under control, and as a result you engage less with Chinese because you're stuck in your flashcard app. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that progress in apps is not the same as progress with the Chinese language. You can study Chinese in Duolingo for 1,000 days straight and still not be able to have even a simple conversation in the language. So the general problem here is not measurement. Measurement can make learning more motivating. The problem is when you let apps or the app developers set goals and priorities for you. Ask yourself this. Am I doing this because this is the best thing for my Chinese right now, or because it makes me feel productive because a number ticks up or I can check a box or whatever it might be? As mentioned, we talked about this more in episode 301, so tune into that next if you want to learn more. This means it's time to wrap up this episode by saying that you should use technology, but use it wisely. Technology really can make learning Chinese a lot easier, but that doesn't mean that more technology is always better. And as we have seen in this episode, there are many traps that you need to be aware of. Otherwise, technology might make you learn less Chinese instead of making it easier. The answer is clearly not to reject technology. The answer is to use it with a clear purpose and be aware of what you're doing. Here are 4 questions you can ask yourself when using digital tools. First, does it reduce the amount of Chinese that I use? Second, does this change which skill I'm practicing in an unintended way? Third, does this make me process the Chinese less deeply? And fourth, does this make me chase a measurable proxy instead of meaningful progress? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, that does not automatically mean that you should stop using the tool, but it does mean that you should be aware of how it affects your learning in the long term and what trade-offs are involved. If you can avoid these traps, digital technology remains one of the best things that has ever happened to Chinese learners. Use it, but use it wisely. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.